Not to be very embarrassing to start the episode, but I was listening to one of our own episodes today, and I think what
That's your first mistake.
Yeah, I know. It's usually hard to get through, but what it's really missing is like some like good ad lib, like yeah, or like I think it needs some more hype, is what I'm saying.
You need to like zoomer it up, is what you're saying?
You give me a very skeptical look.
Okay.
Hi, Dom.
Okay, anyways, welcome back, everyone. Today we are talking about Matt's favorite subject other than sheep.
I mean, William of Orange, obviously. It's time we, like, buckle down on this guy and share some serious knowledge.
The Warrange, you mean? The war on the Warrange? The carrot guy?
Do not care at all.
Care at all? Get it? Nice work, Matt.
I'm not proud of that.
I mean, you should be. But today we are actually talking about your other favorite subject, permaculture.
Well, it's always been the big three for me. William of Orange, permaculture, and Dom, can you add a bleep sound effect here?
You hear that list a lot, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, do you?
No, you don't, actually.
Okay.
So, chances are, if you are listening to this, you're familiar with permaculture. It's a bit of a catch-all for like all alternatives to conventional agriculture. Part of this attraction comes from its broad strokes ethics, which leaves, let's say, a lot to the interpretation of the end user, as well as its capacity to absorb other concepts into this like broad systems idea. We're talking about like organics, biodynamics, no-till, regenerative grazing, perennial agriculture, tree crops, agroecology. While they may not define themselves as permaculture practices, permaculture does define them as permaculture practices.
It's like a big one-way funnel. Everything's permaculture that wants it to be.
Yeah. Super fun.
It's really frustrating, like when have to like define these practices.
Yeah, and I mean I'm not saying this whole series has been about permaculture, like the 20 episodes, but I do think like part of that was like to contextualize some of this, right? And for us to fully understand how and why the permaculture movement has grown into what it is today, we have to understand how it got there and where it came from. To do that, we have to understand its founders and the work that influenced them. And that means we have to understand the history of David Holmgren, Bill Mollison, the permanent agriculture movement, all the stuff we've covered at this point up until the 70s.
Unfortunately, we've covered that last part in over 18 episodes, probably well over 20 hours.
That's all. So if you've got a 24-hour sleep study to do that you don't want to sleep in, I've got the perfect solution.
They put this on and like blast it to prisoners to extract confessions.
I wouldn't believe it. Or I would believe it, rather.
It's like two guys complaining about stuff that happened a long time ago and doesn't matter that much. It's like every sports history podcast.
Exactly. Except it's more niche. You're going to make sure that they don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It just makes it really annoying versus like really endearing.
True.
Fortunately, we've covered it over the last 18 episodes. The next 18 episodes, we're going to go into the excruciating detail of the lives of Holmgren and Mollison.
Oh, please, Jesus, no.
Won't we find out, Matthew?
Fuck.
Now, born in 1928 in the fishing village of Stanley on the northwest coast of Tasmania, our good friend Bill, whose given name was Bruce Mollison, was the son of a man named Rowan, and his mom was a woman named Amy. Didn't really like her. We're going to get there. So his parents ran a butter factory and later built the village bakehouse that Bill took over at the age of 14 when his father died. And he would do things. One of the things that they've noted was that he used to deliver bread on horse. So
okay, cute.
That's cool, I guess. Leaving home in his teens after calling his mother a bully, he found himself working as a fisherman to keep himself fed. In his 20s, he worked as a seaman, mill worker, driver, forester, and trapper.
I mean, a butter factory sounds so fake. Whose family, like, runs a butter factory?
So you're saying you can believe it's not butter?
Andy, I'm going to leave this Zoom. Have fun with the next 13 pages.
You mean 17 and a half episodes?
Yeah.
So by the 1940s, He ended up joining the Air Training Corps and was flying tiger moths during the Second World War. However, all of his experiences working in the forests, working on the oceans, all of this really pushed him to want to be a part of like rural life. That was what he was attracted to. This led to him joining the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, aka CSIRO. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. I'm going with that though. He joined this organization in 1954, and he worked in agricultural research for about a decade, 10 years or so, before he decided, you know what, it's time for me to go back to school. And he went back to school to study biogeography. In his autobiography, Travels and Dreams, which is excruciatingly hard to find for the record, Bill talks about his realization that humans could copy natural systems back in 1959 to what he regards as the generative thought behind permaculture. He states that while observing marsupials in the Tasmanian rainforest, he wrote in his diary that, in quote, "I believe that we could build systems that would function as well as this one does."
Okay, so I thought it was based on like indigenous practices.
Yeah, so we're going to get to that. In an interview with Scott London, he backs that this is the original framework basis of his permaculture concept. He says that I was in the Tasmanian rainforest, studying the interaction between browsing marsupials and forest regeneration. We weren't having a lot of success regenerating forests with a big marsupial population. So I created a simple system with 23 wooded plant species, of which only 4 were dominant and only 2 real browsing marsupials. It was a very flexible system based on the interactions of components, not types of species. It occurred to me one evening that we could build systems that worked better than that one.
So he was like, nature is good, but I can do better.
Yeah, no God complex at all. None. It's fine. Don't think about it. As the 50s continued on and developers began to destroy the landscape around him, he decided his best efforts to stop the encroachment was to actively participate in the environmental policy of the country by going into research and academic teaching. He graduated from university in his mid-40s in the late 1960s, and shortly after was appointed a lecturer at Hobart University, where he had studied in 1968. Shortly after, he ended up developing a new discipline, environmental psychology. Being the 70s, he did a lot of radical stuff. He ran as a green type of candidate for local elections. He pushed back against the destruction of the ecosystems around him with protests and so on. And it was actually during a campaign against the dam on the Franklin River in Tasmania where he would meet David Holmgren.
Dun, dun, dun.
Enter David Holmgren. But first, commercial.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun.
Hey folks, thanks for listening. This is Andy from the Poor Proles Almanac. Hopefully you're enjoying the podcast so far, and right now I'm talking to you from a commercial in a Poor Proles Almanac podcast. I'm sure you're enjoying the show and maybe even enjoying some of our ridiculous ads. We are able to keep our episodes ad-free and keep the lights on here because of support from listeners like you. If you think we're adding valuable perspective to the subjects of agriculture, ecology, climate change, and politics, then please consider giving us some support on Venmo, Ko-Fi, Patreon, or PayPal, all of which can be found at our website, poorproles.com. Please, don't make me go to Jeff for money.
Jeffrey Bezos. Jeffrey Bezos.
Do you think the podcast can afford to buy me an organ? Like,
Yes.
for podcast use, of course. Just for foreshadowing.
Obviously. You're going to learn to play the organ just for foreshadowing music.
Yeah, what else do you use it for?
Baseball music.
Friggin' hymns? Don't think so.
Take me out to the ball
that's
game.
true.
No. See, it's
Yeah,
dual
I can,
use,
I
dual
can learn
purpose.
charge.
And you can also play in churches. You're a triple threat.
That's what they call a triple threat. Baseball, church, and theater. Dracula.
Yes. And Dread.
And Dread. Yeah, the big three.
Is the big three. Anyways, all right.
Sorry.
Welcome back, everyone. I don't know if that's recorded or not, but sorry if it was. Let's talk about David Holmgren. Holmgren was a lot younger than Mollison. he also has described his childhood as very different than Mollison's as well. He talks extensively that his parents were Marxists who towed the party line until they didn't, and that they were very open and progressive people, and that sometimes made it difficult to do teenager stuff like be a rebel and so on. So after he graduated from high school in 1972, he decided he would hitchhike around the country. The idea of like, I need to figure out what the hell I want to do in my life. So he did this, and he ended up in Tasmania in 1974 to study environmental landscape design. Part of his draw to that specific school was the lead architect, a guy named Barry McNeil, who was, according to Holmgren, in his words, the most radical experiment in tertiary education in Australia. The school had no fixed curriculum. There was a self-assessment process at the end of each semester, which then led to a major study at the end of the 3-year degree.
God, that's some real boomer shit right there.
Yeah, like no grades, doesn't matter, just do whatever you want. During this period, David was exploring as part of his research in school various methods of self-sufficiency, and this is something he would continue to tinker with inside and outside of permaculture. It manifests in a book called Retro Suburbia, which came out a few years ago. We're going to be talking about it in a couple weeks. Obviously, the 70s, as everyone knows listening to this, was this really great experimental period. It was also an experimental period in landscape architecture, as folks like Ian McHarg was gaining prominence. And I know we talked about this, I think, in the Back to the Land, but E.F. Schumacher had released a book called Small is Beautiful. It's that book where the term appropriate technology was first coined. There was a lot of change happening all at once. And for Holmgren, this is a little bit of where that beginning of permaculture's landscape design was beginning to form. David describes trying to tie agroecology, organics, and landscape design into one comprehensive narrative. And in his words, agroecology, for example, didn't seem to have much of a design focus. That there was some crossover between landscape architecture and agriculture, but really as cosmetic design overlay in some particular affluent parts, end quote. So basically, he felt that agroecology was too functional from like a conventional standpoint, and that he felt was a shortfall.
I mean, I guess it makes sense that they'd be like familiar with agroecology, but it's kind of surprising they've looked at it and decided it wasn't enough. Or that they like couldn't work with it, but they had to make it something different.
Yeah, and like I understand David Holmgren because he was like 20, 21. Like when you're that age, you're supposed to be like, I can change the world. But like with Mollison, I think he was too old to be that visionary and like that like optimistic, right? Like if you haven't started this yet, it's a little late in your life to be like, I'm going to change everything. If you're like over 40 and still think you can revolutionize the world, like I need those drugs.
It's a Colonel Sanders syndrome. It's like 75 when he struck it big.
Yeah. Yeah, they're like, well, if Colonel Sanders can do it, I can too, god damn it. Holmgren was a student, in a sense, for Mollison. And as they started developing this idea of permaculture, it really started in 1974, and that led to the portmanteau of permaculture, meaning permanent agriculture, in 1975. The date often seen in histories of the words permaculture is 76 or 77, but I did find a short essay on nuts by Mollison in 1975, and this appears to be the first time the terminology was ever documented. David explains that the birth of permaculture actually came from a very specific discussion with Bill about his research. So David was trying to figure out his like major thesis concept for his program, right? And he felt really frustrated with like landscape design and agroecology and organic agriculture, to which point Mollison just responded to Dave that he should focus on answering the design question of how natural systems design forests and other ecosystems. It also raised the question of why humans, in David's words, don't appear to be using that in our prime activity on the planet, agriculture, by which we feed ourselves.
I mean, he's not really wrong.
Yeah, so through 1975 and 76, Holmgren and Mollison lived together alongside Bill's second wife, Philomena, and her son. With the help of Andrew Jeeves, they were able to translate the work of Masanobu Fukuoka into English. They pulled the work of Ken Yalmans, so if you're familiar with the keyline design, that guy, as well as F.H. King, who we talked about 14 episodes ago, his book, Farmers of 40 Centuries. And they took this all to try to create a universal framework for the permanency of like human activities on the landscape. Now, this was also paired with that experimental architecture that Holmgren was attracted to, as well as the work of the Odom brothers, who we've also talked about. And for those who haven't listened to that episode, they had worked to create basically mathematical models of what sustainable agriculture would have to look like. So David wrote down the framework that they developed alongside one another. And this ultimately became Permaculture 1. And this was actually originally David's graduate thesis and was then later published as this book a few years later. Now, Mollison was still teaching at the University of Tasmania, and Holmgren was still just recently graduated design student when the book came out.
I mean, say what you want. That's pretty cool that they starting to put that stuff together.
It is, but also as somebody who's got a decade plus on Holmgren at that point, I have a hard time listening to somebody 20, 21 years old telling me the way to live. You know what I mean?
True.
It does feel a little
I'm gonna tell you what you need to do. I'm gonna work it all out for you.
You got this?
Yeah, I got this.
All right. So after they spent these years working together, putting together this book, they birthed this baby, Permaculture 1, and then they quietly disbanded. For folks listening that are familiar with Bill Mollison, he was pretty well known for being kind of difficult to work with, or in his case, be married to, because he did have 5 wives throughout his life. But his knowledge was expansive, and his capacity to engage with students and make them feel special and excited made him particularly appealing as this figurehead of the movement. Immediately after they parted ways, Mollison focused on building the movement and exposing himself to new ideas across the globe while still developing the vision of permaculture he had begun to cultivate. At the same time, Holmgren decided to go to New Zealand and basically put his ideas into action. Like I said, he was 20, 21 years old. He wanted to know that he was actually doing a thing that made sense. So while he was off in New Zealand for the next while, Mollison pushed for the founding of the Permaculture Institute, the Permaculture Association, and its quarterly publication, Permaculture, and shortly after, the Permaculture International Journal, as well as the development of the Tagari Publishing Company in 1979, and then Permaculture 2, the follow-up book the same year, and most significantly, the 3-week residential course that would become the foundation for the first permaculture design course in 1979. The books that came out, Permaculture 1 and 2, had a circulation of over 100,000 copies by 1985.
I mean, that's a lot of material for something that, no one had really done yet.
More or less, yeah. They definitely put the cart before the horse on this one. At first, the movement centered around Maryborough, and this is just kind of ground zero for where people that were into permaculture, very early on, happened to be. That town ended up hosting 2 permaculture conferences and 2 of the first 10-day consultancy courses. As the oil crisis, which we talked about in the Back to the Land movement, and the homesteading movement kind of took hold across the globe, people were super interested in how do we live if oil's, we've hit peak oil, what are we going to do? So people were open to the concept of permaculture.
So they did what the Odoms wanted to do.
Kind of. They were in the right place at the right time. The permaculture design course developed by Mollison was the catalyst for the movement and fed into many of Mollison's skills, or shortcomings, depending on how you look at it. In Holmgren's own words, he said, "Although Bill denied the mantle of permaculture guru, I knew too well that his dynamic combination of polymath, jack of all trades, charismatic yarn spinner, and huge ego were a dangerous mix to be at the head of such a movement." Many of the early adopters of the permaculture movements were also worried about Bill and the destruction of the movement because Bill was so willing to just throw everything at the wall. And in the words of one of them, Mollison's followers were getting launched hopelessly unprepared on the real world as design consultants and activists trying to make a permaculture world. Holmgren fully understood that the concept of permaculture was still being fleshed out, that while he was working through his own ideas, he watched them in real time becoming turned into ideology that he, in his own words, attempted to correct.
That sounds pretty unsurprising, to be honest. That makes a lot of sense for what permaculture is today.
Yeah, you can see how it was led by people that didn't know what they're doing, and a lot of permaculture design courses today are also led by people who don't know what they're doing, even though there's now 50, 60 years of history, it still feels like we're still stuck in that mindset, right?
Yeah, and I think also just like the description of Mollison is definitely, well, I don't know if it's like an actual archetype, but like the farmer archetype that's like can do a little bit of everything and is like the master of like I feel
Master
like
of
that's
none.
a relatively like common thing to see from like farmers with big egos.
Yeah, I'd agree. Holmgren, after he had left Mollison early on, went to New Zealand, connected with a guy named Hakai Tain, who he described as his second mentor in permaculture. Now, they have a really interesting meeting story. It starts with them meeting and discussing Mollison, actually. And the guy, Hakai, had been told to spread gorse across an overgrazed hill. Gorse is a noxious weed in New Zealand, or so I've been told. Hakai disagreed and instead believed a better plant would have been briar rose, which is another noxious invasive weed. It was his refusal to acknowledge the impacts of these invasives that is what drew Holmgren into saying, like, I want to know more about this guy. I'm very curious about the way he thinks.
Yes, I see you have a refined palate for devastating noxious invasive species.
Yeah, right. It's a chef's kiss.
Mwah.
You too destroy the planets. Now, in the early 1990s, a farm near Mollison's home went up for sale, and another new experiment unfolded called Permaculture Commonworks. This is a really interesting concept that unfortunately did fail, but I think it speaks a little bit to permaculture in general. But it was designed to be a site where individuals, for a fee, would be able to set up income-producing businesses using the farm itself. So various people got involved. They would plant market gardens. They would grow bamboo for like tomato stalks. They would have chickens for eggs, fruit trees. Fish was raised for market purposes. But within a few years, the whole thing kind of collapsed.
Okay, so what made it collapse?
We don't actually know, but my guess is there wasn't an infrastructure of support. It was just kind of like a free-for-all. It speaks to the fact that scalability in a marketplace, especially for agriculture, is so important. That's why like Sylvan Aqua farms can be successful, but most people in a backyard garden really struggle, right? I think what's interesting is that like it points to the fact that there's more to it than just having the right ecological ethics to try to cross the bridge of I'm doing this because it's good for the environment and I'm doing this because it's also going to be profitable, right? Those are two different conversations that don't overlap very often. To switch back to Holmgren, it wasn't until 2002 that Holmgren became a public figure on permaculture. And this is only because he had released a book called Permaculture, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. The book highlighted the work he'd been doing and the lessons learned from hands-on experience. He was able to go on these speaking tours across the nation, and it kind of reinforced his role as a founder of permaculture because Mollison had just been kind of the focal point of the movement for nearly 2 decades.
I mean, at least he went and like tried to do it before jumping on the speaking circuit.
Yeah, and I think that's something worth like commending at least. Now, we can find the earliest arrivals of permaculture here in the United States in the early 1980s, with the earliest permaculture event being documented on April 3rd through 5th, 1981, which was the Interior Region Permaculture Conference in Sagal, Idaho, which...
Shout out Sagal.
I don't know if you remember what was going on in places like Idaho. Yeah, we talked a lot about Idaho in the Aryan Nations 2 weeks ago around this time. So, you know, just something I'm throwing out there. Now, over 1,000 people attended the first of a 2-part series of Northwest Permaculture conferences hosted by the Friends of the Trees. In 1986, a few years later, the second international conference took place outside of Australia at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. And this featured Mollison, Masanobu Fukuoka, Wes Jackson, who's the founder of the Land Institute, and many more.
I mean, that's quite a lineup. That must have been several worlds colliding.
Yeah, and it was kind of permaculture's splash to gain legitimacy in the United States. This has made the Pacific Northwest kind of a hotspot for permaculture in the country today. Like, that is where you're going to find most of the people doing this stuff. Following the lead of Australia, there was some interesting stuff that kind of springboarded off of permaculture. So we didn't talk about it, but they tried to create cooperative banks, ethical financing, funding, investing, and they tried to do that in the United States as well with the Earth Bank Society. They created this thing called the Sustainable Economics Guide, and it was a socially responsible credit union in Puget Sound, Washington State. Unfortunately, it only lasted a couple years, and by 1987, the entire Earth Bank Society no longer existed in the United States.
Womp womp. Can we add a trombone to the instrument budget?
I have a trombone. All you had to do is ask.
Great. I'll expect it next episode.
No problem. So, while most folks at this point are pretty familiar with a lot of the influences on permaculture, since we've covered quite a few of them, there's a few more worth mentioning. Like we had mentioned, Yaumans with the keyline water harvesting system, Jeff Wallace of Aeroplow fame, if you're not familiar with the Aeroplow, Gregory Bateson, which is one of the original members of the Macy Conference, which we spoke about in the first episode, I think we did. Obviously Fukuoka, Buckminster Fuller, just to name like a few. Holmgren also argues that patterning is the basis of permaculture, right? That is the permaculture design, not just like growing food. It's a design. It's a pattern language. In Retro Suburbia, he goes into a little bit more detail about this, and he talks about how Christopher Alexander's work heavily influenced the development of permaculture. And he speaks specifically to two of his books, The Timeless Way of Building and A Pattern Language, which were written in 1976 and 1977.
I mean, being the designer, that's not surprising.
Yeah, he argues that the architectural frameworks highlight similar problems with food systems design. And he explains that, in quote, each pattern was formulated as a relationship between a context, a problem that repeatedly arises in that context, and a spatial arrangement that resolves the problem in that context, which is just a fancy way of saying patterns can fix otherwise difficult situations. So a pattern language, the book outlines 253 patterns that are used in the entire built environment where the book was written. Now, the general idea is that everything can be broken down into patterns, that specific patterns address specific issues, and finding the pattern that best fits a series of specific issues can be modeled in a nearly infinite amount of ways, meaning that as long as you have these specific, in this book's case, 253 set of tools, you can address nearly every issue. But the real issue is that this isn't entirely what Alexander believed either, even if that's how people understood his work.
Oh good, someone's ideas were misconstrued and fundamentally shifted the trajectory of alternative agriculture.
Brilliant.
Just a little thing.
Just a little thing. And it raises this really interesting question, though, of how do universal objective concepts fit into a world with, like, historical context and precedent and messy, unfinished history, right? And this is a problem that's been facing permaculture, and it's kind of been a thorn in the movement's side as it thinks about, like, decolonizing it, right? Now, while one side of it's, like, rabidly against changing anything, you know, the side that is in Idaho and dipping their toes into the blood and soil movement and, like, really bringing permaculture into homesteading, those people don't want anything to do with that conversation, while the decolonized people do want to engage with that historical context.
And surprisingly, we're back to where we left off last week. Jesus Christ, this thing's really gotten away from us.
Yeah, no, we're not going down that rabbit hole today. But before we can continue on Alexander's ideas of patterns, we should take a quick break.
Hey, we're taking a quick break in the episode to remind you that you can get a whole lot more information from poorproles.com. On our website, we have access to our supplemental reader for the podcast, which provides more depth and context as well as thorough citations for all of the stuff we talk about in the show. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which updates you about limited releases, such as various nursery stock that we sometimes sell through the Poor Proles website, as well as updates about new merch that we have. You can also support the show through that website, poorproles.com, where you have access to our Patreon and our Substack to get early releases for articles and episodes. Now, if you enjoy the show and are just looking for even more audio content, go check out Tomorrow Today, which just wrapped up season 1, or tune into The Gastropocene, which is a project of myself and Dr. Aisha Khan to discuss the way our diets have driven the Anthropocene and what it looks like to use our diets for good. Now, back to the show.
So it's worth considering why Alexander's ideas thrived in software development and faltered in architecture. Many theorists, people that have too many degrees and too much time, argue that he hasn't been given his earned space in academia, that he's just too visionary, and architecture just wasn't ready for him. I disagree, and I think Alexander would probably agree with me too. He wasn't really happy that his ideas were taken to be this universal application. He actually had stated himself that his patterns were based on where he lived, and it wasn't to simply boil down patterns. So within that context, I think it makes sense that it really thrived in software development, because by definition, novel technologies, especially ones that don't exist in space, right? They don't have that complicated history of colonization and the nuance of a landscape. If you're designing software, it's in a very specific, rigid framework, right?
You get a clean slate.
You got a clean slate, and you can do these things that you really can't do in the real world, right? So yeah, its success in that space isn't surprising, but it does help contextualize why or how you can envision it working if you don't consider that deeper problem, right?
Yeah, so it's these ideas developed without a historical context. That sounds pretty close to permaculture.
Exactly. So it's no surprise then that Alexander's work was so influential on Holmgren and Mollison. It entirely ignored the historical context and cultural complexities in which the what you might consider an objective best choice doesn't have to deal with and wrestle with and negotiate with historical precedents of cultures that are living, have been erased, have been changed, both for humans and non-humans, right? Landscapes that have been totally destroyed, as well as the people that lived on them or are actively living on them, right? Without this context, though, any person that takes the right education, hint, hint, can create systems to address the large-scale problems of food production without ever having to step foot there, without ever having to speak with people who lived there or family comes from there or have historically stewarded that landscape. And this is something that we see a lot with permaculture consultants. And of course, there's always exceptions, but by and far, this is more common to be that narrative, right? You see these people that travel globally to give insight into best practices without any real material depth of understanding of that historical context.
Kind of sounds like the Odoms.
Exactly. And again, a huge influence on permaculture. So you can start to see this redundancy in these blind spots in the permaculture movement, right? In Holmgren's 2011 book, Permaculture Principles, he dedicates 3 chapters explicitly to the theories of the Odoms, around energy and emergy and systems design. So if you guys aren't familiar with the Odoms, you want to learn more about this, that's a really good spot to pick up a lot of this depth that we're kind of going into. So the Odoms run up against the same problems as Alexander, that their work is completely devoid of this historical context. They don't seem to really understand how and why systems that are in place were put in place or self-organized in a way that made sense that way, right? So the Odoms didn't necessarily, they were more aware of the ecological components, I think, than Mollison and Holmgren. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, how ecology was a little bit different for the Odoms, but by and large, they pretty much had similar beliefs about we can make systems better, and that nature has a crude understanding that we can refine. So while permaculture is framed around these design principles, which Mollison and Holmgren said are these are universal design principles, we can apply them anywhere. Not only can we apply them anywhere for food systems, we should be applying them to all of our facets of life. So this is where you hear people talking about permaculturing our cities, permaculturing our transportation, permaculturing our communities, and you just want to beat yourself with a brick. The problem is when you start digging into the permaculture ethics component of it that are framed within this pattern system, it's very broad stroke stuff, and it's like very, very feel good type equalities that are not in any way unique or special to permaculture. And in reality, they just kind of reshape how communities have always organized and supported each other and been in community throughout history.
Yeah, I mean, it does kind of have some like cultish vibes where like they think they've created something entirely like novel and it's just a rebranded lizard people.
I mean, that really is the universal cult truth, though, like lizard people.
Maybe the lizard people made up the lizard people theory, so it sounds insane.
Are you talking about lizardception?
Jesus, that's old.
I mean, it makes sense.
I mean, Bill Mollison is a lizard.
Was a lizard.
I mean, okay, if we're thinking about like, let's add a little context, shall we?
Give me it.
If Australia is this like homeland of permaculture, it makes sense that it would be a lizard.
Tropics, warm weather, checks out. A lot of dinosaur bones, that's all I'm going to say.
Have we ever seen Bill Mollison next to a fly?
Funny story, we haven't. That's so strange, right? We should probably look into that more.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so back to this like cult thing, though. The framework, I want to talk about these frameworks a little bit because I do think it's important to like, especially when people make it like the way they view the world, which is especially concerning to me. When we talk about frameworks like the ones in permaculture, they can be really helpful if they help people construct new ways or ideas to think about the world around them in useful ways. Frameworks are supposed to be tools for assessment and measurement and understanding how things relate to one another, right? But frameworks shouldn't be rigid, locked systems, because when you do that, you limit the capacity of the results. If you don't have an iterative process, so like if you're not constantly taking the feedback from that framework to improve that framework, then you end up in basically a linear logic process of guiding your thoughts to very specific places and almost like generating predetermined outcomes. Like very much like the thing that stands out to me is the age-old permaculture quote, "You don't have a slug problem, you have a duck deficiency," or whatever it is. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You've heard that? And like how many times you hear that exact phrasing in the permaculture space, that your problem is your solution. That limits you in reality. It can sound very creative and cheeky and like revolutionary, but also it is setting you up to have this very specific thought process that has a predetermined outcome where you're looking at the problem for a solution.
Now I gotta have ducks around instead of a little copper strip.
Yeah, it limits your capacity of like, okay, how do I get rid of the slugs? What do I, you're creating a more complicated system. And maybe for that person, that's not really what they want, but you've created this logic process that is setting you up for a very specific outcome, right? And if you don't have the tools to break out of that mentality, it's not helpful, it's not constructive, and it's, in fact, can be pretty damaging. Now, when we talk about like Western science and even Indigenous science, these like very science-based practices are framed within an iterative nature, right? If we look at the way we handle things in science, like Western science, if something doesn't work, we figure out why it doesn't work and we try to fix it, right? In like historical context, when ecosystems changed and Indigenous people learned to change their living processes to those new ecological conditions. We talked about this a lot when we were talking about the Turkana. This is going back to like episode like 18. And we talked about how they had lived next to a lake and this
is for the day ones.
Yes. The rainforest around the lake had eventually died because the massive ecological changes in the region and the cultural change. They didn't continuously try to live the way they had historically lived. They evolved with those new conditions because they were getting that feedback from that system, right? And that's the part that is so important, is having that continuous change in what the system looks like. The problem is that like it's not just about permaculture. It's not just about growing food and like having a backyard fucking food forest. It's bigger than that because it's about how to apply this method to the world instead of asking which aspects of permaculture are helping and how they can either be changed or eliminated to make a better world, right? It's not about changing permaculture. It's about changing everything else to permaculture. And those are very different conversations, and one is very destructive and another is possibly could be good. But if you don't have that nuance to it, then it can be very destructive. And this becomes really obvious when you start looking at like YouTube permaculture farms, these people that put swales in where they don't need swales. People talking about dynamic accumulators, which doesn't have any scientific backing. People talking about like the guilds, when in reality it's just diversity of plants reduces pest pressure. Instead, trying to make it sound like there's this deep reason why fucking comfrey or something is uniquely special for your guild and you need it next to your apple tree. And there's no actual evidence for any of this shit, but because that is the narrative that's been created in permaculture, it becomes like this religious component to it, right? It's like praying to the rosary beads is like going through the fucking permaculture ethics.
I know, listeners, it seems like this guy hasn't been reading the scrolls.
I have not read the scrolls, and that's that is
that's
like
your problem.
The other.
If you read the
Yes.
scrolls, you'd understand.
I would, and that is the thing. Like, if I criticize permaculture, which obviously we do quite a bit, most of the feedback that we get, or I get, is that I don't know what I'm talking about. Despite the fact that I've been doing this for decades, despite the fact that I've probably at this point written more on permaculture from an objective standpoint than anyone else on the earth. That's not like a permaculturalist, right? So I would say I'm probably pretty qualified to talk about it, having taken permaculture classes and so on and so forth. And it's not that I want to take down permaculture. I just want to be able to engage in a nuanced conversation of this is not going to solve the world or fix anything, right? Now, I do want to talk a little bit more about this idea of like indigenous sovereignty, because I think this is one of the more hot topics in the permaculture dialogue today. One thing we're starting to see is like a bit of rewriting around the history of permaculture. In my interview with Holmgren, he argues that Mollison explicitly gives proper credit to Aboriginal residents of Australia for the framework of permaculture, which at this point we've made clear that Mollison repeatedly was like, no, I learned it from watching kangaroos, not from Indigenous people. Even in Holmgren's autobiography, he explicitly states in the excerpt that's pulled in Permaculture International Journal's 1996 edition that, in quote, by 1972, I spent hours with David Holmgren and others trying to articulate whole systems designs. There were no precursors.
Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty explicit. And I feel like it's also kind of a common theme around these sort of like this like type of farmer that there needs to be like epiphany. You know what I mean? Unique,
special.
Yeah, and there needs to be
revolutionary.
A ray of light shining down and enlightenment, instead of like learning the context that you're in and like the best way for you to like fit into that.
Yeah, I think it speaks to like our need to be special and individualistic, right?
Right.
That we, even people on the left will be like, I believe in community, blah, blah, blah. But we still have this draw to the fact that this white man came up with this thing, right?
And it's just ego.
It is. And he has some other more egotistical points on this too that I want to talk about. So, it does mention other systems. I'll give you like an example of how he talks about it. So he says in 1977 that, in quote, we stumbled on accounts of some ancient low-energy systems which have survived to the present day as simple permacultures, as in the cork pork forests of Portugal and the date melon goat assembly of Oasis. All showed great stability and complexity with just local species to speak on, end quote. There's a lot to unpack out of that. The question of like indigenous tech being simple permacultures is just like kind of gross, right? It's like white men looking down at ancestral knowledge. And I think it's really insightful about the way Bill himself grapples with this messy subject, that while in this case, he's making a point that like indigenous people might have done it first, but what they did was simple and ancient and low energy and, local, like as though that's a bad thing, and that he discovered how to do it better.
I feel like it's just like following in the footsteps of like a very rich history of discovering it, say like on behalf of the Western world.
Yeah.
Like that sort of, or like discovering it for, yeah.
Yeah. I try to remind myself when we talk about like talking about the 70s and 80s that we are looking at this through some historical lens, right? That this was 50 years ago. But when we talk about retro suburbia, we're going to realize why that's not really accurate, because that was only written a couple of years ago. But that we're going to save for, again, another episode. Now, some have embraced permaculture's history as explicitly led by white men, and others have attempted to like decolonize this movement. Interestingly enough, this isn't simply split by like politics. Some people, even on the left, feel that indigenous peoples have their own systems and they aren't permaculture anyway, but something entirely different that may also be cool.
I mean, they're not permaculture, but they're cool and they're similar and they're not the same, and just fucking vibes all around.
Yeah, basically. The more popular opinion from the left can be focused on like decentering the white figureheads of Mollison and Holmgren and selectively choosing the science that backs the movement, and when it doesn't, hiding behind ambiguous like indigenous science claims, even if there's no indigeneity to it. So like Hugel mounds, for example, are one of those things that permaculture is like ancient science, and even though it's from biodynamics, which I didn't even get my chance to like shit on that in the biodynamics episode because we didn't have time, but that's like a really clear example of like, this is not ancient tech. This is something that came about 80 years ago. There's no science behind it, but because it fell into permaculture, people code it a certain way and try to defend it using things that are not really appropriate for it, like saying that, well, indigenous people have been doing this for thousands of years when it's not actually true. But because they want it to be true, they just kind of espouse it as fact, right? I also see a lot of like really uncomfortable, like lazy, awkward attempts to like, I don't even want to say like build bridges with indigenous people, but like almost the whole like fucking land, what's the word I'm looking for, Matt?
Land back?
Acknowledgement. That's
land
it.
acknowledgement.
Yeah. Doing things like land acknowledgements or like on unceded blah, blah, blah lands, but like not making any material changes, right? I'll steal some words from one of the writers from this perspective, Jesse Watson, who says, if permaculture has as its ethical foundation earth care, people care, and fair share or future care, what do those words mean in this light, given the fact that people like me passively benefit from systematic forms of oppression and genocide that continue today?
I mean, they raise a good point. And the fact that permaculture does have a habit of like hiding behind pseudoscience the same way that we saw the biodynamic and like the organic movement before that doing just the same.
Yeah. One of the other things that you see a lot of is that a lot of permaculturalists will argue that Mollison did, in fact, give full credit to the influences of the Aboriginal people of Australia. I'm not doubting or denying him his relationships with the Aboriginal Australians. When he was living in the bush, he had close relationships in those decades that he was living in those landscapes. He even wrote a book of genealogy on Aboriginal Australians. But the idea that he gave any like real credit to these people at the beginning of his books isn't really backed by any of the evidence. So being me, I basically read every book that either of them ever wrote on permaculture. And in Permaculture 1, he does mention Aboriginal agriculture early on in the book and simply states that, in quote, Aboriginal Tasmanians lived in small tribal territories only a day's walk across and resided there for some 20,000 years before whites came. From such a long period of control and selection, each region was a highly evolved permaculture region sufficient to sustain tribal life indefinitely. Now, over the 100+ pages in the book, the term Aboriginal or Aborigines is only found in 4 paragraphs, and the specific tribe that Mollison would have been most likely inspired by was entirely absent. In Permaculture 2, again, Mollison brings up the Aborigines of Tasmania, but again doesn't ever point explicitly to their contributions, but rather levels them as a metaphor about memory and who, in his words, ensured the tribal permaculture endured. Again, he assigns a new term, permaculture, to people that have been living on the landscape for thousands of years, applying a label to a group of people who have historically been marginalized, silenced, and disenfranchised without their opinion on the matter or without being consulted, or at least any evidence of them having been consulted before he included this. And in many ways, this act is more like another form of, almost like a more insidious form of colonization, because it's not just taking their ideas and like kind of treating them as a footnote, but also like gaslighting them by speaking for them. And it doesn't really show any like relationship of true mutual respect or regard. And that's not to say he didn't have it. It's just there's no real evidence of him crediting Indigenous people in a way that really like matters.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of this, you know, when you read like histories like that, it's referring to Indigenous people almost as like myth rather than like actual people that did actual work.
And we're like had diversity of opinions and thoughts and
Right.
all these different things that make us human, and other people like almost to like paraphrase from Lenin, like, or Stalin, whichever murderer, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths are a statistic.
Yeah,
It kind of leans into that.
you're absolutely right. It's dehumanization.
Yeah, and like it's again not to say that like Mollison like did that on purpose, but I think we're disingenuous to say that it's not there. Again, like when you start pairing all of the ways that we have him sitting down and writing and thoughtfully putting together what he wants the world to see, his vision, and that was the best that he could do to like articulate this part of it, to like talk about like the cork pork system, so to speak, and like to call it like simple ancient permaculture. Like it's disrespectful for the fact that the landscape, you know, we've covered the Dehesas of Portugal and Spain, and like they were incredibly diverse and creative and like wildly efficient systems for one of a more difficult ecosystem to live on, and to like talk about it so casually is like really disrespectful. Now I do want to then, you know, we've had this conversation of isn't it permaculture? If it is, then, or if it fits Mollison's definition, what does that mean? So I'm going to pull his definition of permaculture from the designer's manual. His words are: the harmonious integration of landscape and people providing their food, energy, shelter, and other material and non-material needs in a sustainable way. So within that context, yes, like tech, indigenous agriculture does fall under this umbrella, right? But again, he seems to look down at these practices belonging to another time, that they were like 1.0 and he's going to do 2.0, that what they figured out in thousands of years of agriculture and living on the land, he was going to improve in his 20 years in his backyard homestead, right? That somehow he was going to get 2.0 when they only had 1.0. And that like permaculture is this future ethical framework that society should be organized around, which is just like, when you put it in that dialogue, it almost seems like wildly narcissistic. I don't know your thoughts about that, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just the same thing that we were talking about earlier. It's needing to have this like epiphany or this like revolutionary concept instead of understanding what came before you.
Yeah.
And just for our listeners, when you say tech, you mean traditional ecological knowledge, right?
Yes. Putting this within that decolonization framework, or how do we decolonize permaculture, right? The question that really gets laid at that is like, how do we repatriate this knowledge and the land and lifeways to indigenous people where I am? Like if I believe in permaculture and I want to decolonize it and, you know, restore it, be restorative in this process, right? How do I do that? The problem is what we've been talking about, that we're framing this permaculture perspective. We're applying modern terms to replace ancestral practices, whether or not they've been lost, which obviously like muddies up the water in places where they have been lost. And it also really is difficult to engage with when we start talking about this question of like, what does indigenous sovereignty look like given the uniqueness of each situation? That the fundamental issue that stems from applying these ahistorical practices is that it's difficult to put that within a historical context where it's a, you know, kind of a stamp, a rubber stamp that they believed in putting on the landscape that doesn't really engage with that history, right? When we talk about like restorative justice, that doesn't mean that if we somehow add a land acknowledgement and GoFundMe to give to indigenous people, if as long as we do those things and we hand them the good word of Mollison and Holmgren, we've decolonized permaculture, right? When we talk about restorative justice, we're talking about giving people the sovereignty to choose whether or not permaculture ethics being front and center over ancestral practices, or even new practices as defined by their own determination without influence of money or being co-opted from these well-meaning but very white-guilted, usually permaculturalists. Like, sovereignty means full self-determination, not influenced by people who feel shitty for things that their ancestors or people who just happen to look like them did in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big issue that these people, they think they're trying to do something to, like, make up for bad shit that white people have done. But instead of, like, handing over power, they just try to use that, like, cultural and economic power that they do have to fix things how they should think it should be fixed. And not just, like, giving over power to those who are powerless. In many ways, it just, like, reinforces the same patterns that make this problem in the first place. I mean, like, going and starting I guess that's the thesis of this whole series, is, like, going and buying land and starting a permaculture farm is just doing that same bad shit.
Yeah, it just looks nicer.
Right.
And you have new terms for it. Like, this is what we see repeatedly play out within the permaculture movement. It's like, how do we navigate this space and, like, not engage with this historical context, right? If we talk about permaculture from, like, a very scientific perspective, I mentioned, like, guilds and, like, the fact that there's no actual evidence for a lot of the things they believe. That raises this question of, can permaculture rely on conventional science? Because that's up for debate in many permaculture circles, because some people in that space don't feel they can trust conventional science because it's owned by big agriculture or whatever, right? Even the sides that do advocate for, like, scientific permaculture, if you start looking at their actual scientific backing, the stuff that has backing is typically agroecology. So, for example, in Permaculture Activist, not one of the sources cited in the article that's called Towards a 21st Century Permaculture, People's Science actually includes the word permaculture. So, like, none of that article about how permaculture needs to engage with science actually has any proof of permaculture engaging with science. The fact that this division can exist highlights how easily the permaculture vision can, like, be manipulated into these different perspectives, and that's for better or worse.
Yeah. Now that we have a little bit of context, I think we've, like, seen similar things happen with organics and biodynamics, that everything that we want it to be, it is, and everything that we find out is bad or unsupported that's not the thing. So it's really, I feel like when you talk about, like, have these conversations about permaculture, nobody's going into it or coming out of it with the same definition of what makes something permaculture.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that quote that people like to share on, like, pictures. It's Chico Mendes talking about farming without class is just gardening.
Yeah,
and that's what it feels like. Like,
environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening.
Yeah, and I think that's, like, the common denominator. Even then, like, oddly enough, the place where we saw class the strongest was the early stages of the organic movement, and that was not for a good reason.
Right.
But that is, like, the most explicit, like, example of, like, class-based systems in the space that we saw, outside of, I guess, the early ag movement in the United States with, like, the farm unions and stuff like that. But, like, it points to the fact that, like, a lot of this is much more complicated, and without having all these different facets, it can become very subjective, right? My point isn't to, I think people assume that my whole thing is, like, I hate permaculture just because, like, it's a fad or something. But
no, it's because you're Oscar the Grouch and you do live in a trash can.
Other than that,
right?
The trees are shading my trash can. How am I supposed to get heat in the winter?
Mm-hmm.
I do think permaculture has had some good effect. It has inspired people to want to make the world better, and I think that's at least worth celebrating. I do think that Mollison and Holmgren were able to tap into, like, this very ancient history in a way that made people feel like it was new and novel, which, I mean, it kind of was because they didn't do it right, but Like, I think they still brought to light some very important conversations that needed to be had. And I think it does offer us a way to start engaging and making things better. That's not to say I ever want to see a permaculture food system, but I do think it does provide us like a stepping stone, right? Like a part of our diversity of opinions, diversity of voices, diversity of experiences is that like none of us is really going to be right, but we do need all of those different pieces to make the right blend that works. That's how I try to think about it.
Yeah, that's a good way to reckon with it, because it's a fucked up subject.
Yeah.
Can't believe we made it.
We're not done yet. This is part 1. Next week, we're going to continue and start all over, but we're going to do a deeper dive on each character. So we're going to talk about Bill Mollison's shoes when he was 7.
I can't wait.
Seriously, though, I do think that Mollison especially would appreciate criticism on like permaculture and pushback. I do think that Holmgren also understands that that's a good thing, that they do need pushback, and that there have been a lot of failures in permaculture, and the fact that it has grown so much but not made any material change in like food systems speaks to the fact that it's not enough. While this is critical of permaculture, I don't think this is necessarily out of scope of what content on permaculture or what permaculturalists think should be a part of the conversation about permaculture, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. So we did drop a bunch of quotes in this episode. You can go check out the Substack, because all of those are cited for you if you're just like,
yes,
he
sir.
said what, where? Agroecologies.org. Go check that out. Next week, I think we're going to talk about invasive species. We're almost done with this series.
Oh my god. Can't wait to talk about invasive species.
I know you can't. I think it's actually just me, though. So you get to take a nice day off. But we will be doing Retro Suburbia next, and I think that is the end of the season. So if you guys enjoyed this, please go give us a review on iTunes. Those are really nice. We like to read them. It's been a while since we've gotten one for some reason. We're almost done with the season, almost summertime. And yeah, if you enjoy the content, can't wait for it to come out. Go check out patreon.com/PoorProleSalmanac, where you can help us keep the lights on, keep my trash can warm.
Mm-hmm. You'll freeze everybody.
I will.
And we can't lose this grouch.
You can't. I'm too important. I am the next Bill Mollison.
Mm-hmm.
I'm coming. But yeah, really. So this was fun. Hope you guys learned something. I definitely did. And yeah, we'll see you guys around.
Later.